Hello and welcome back to Codex Lee. My name is Lee and this is a channel all about books. So last week I revealed the worst 5 books that I read in 2019, and in truth it was much easier to choose the 5 worst books than it was to choose the 5 best books. And that's not because I had too many bad books to choose from. In fact, it was the opposite problem. I read a lot of good books in 2019 and it was really difficult narrowing that down to my top 5. So before we begin counting down the top 5, here are some of the honorary mentions, the ones that didn't quite make it into that list but are definitely worth a mention. Let's start with the non-fiction titles, and first and foremost in that list is Heidi Ardizzone's excellent biography of Belle de Costa Greene, which is called An Illuminated Life. If you haven't heard of Belle de Costa Greene, then I urge you to track down this book and read about this extraordinary woman of colour who pretty much single-handedly ran JP Morgan's private library for about half a century. It really is an extraordinary story, albeit one that quotes a little too liberally from love letters in Ardizzone's telling of it, for my liking. Another non-fiction work that meant a lot to me this year was The Year of Reading Dangerously by Andy Miller. His humorous account of how he changed his reading habits for the better, featuring an ingenious comparison of Moby Dick and the Da Vinci Code. Now, I've given Stephen King a pretty hard time in my 5 worst books that I read in 2019 by including not one but 2 of his books in that list. But I'm going to talk about King in my top 5, but I also want to mention an early non-fiction work that he wrote called Danse Macabre. Now maybe it's just me, but there's nothing quite like reading someone write on a topic about which they're both extremely passionate and extremely knowledgeable. And if anyone qualifies on those 2 counts when it comes to horror, it's Stephen King. 2 non-fiction audiobooks that I really enjoyed but didn't quite make it to my top 5 were Invisible Women by Caroline Criado-Pérez and Between the World and Me by Ta-Nehisi, read by their respective authors. There are many more books I intend to read about the never-ending problems of sexism and racism in the world, but these are 2 at least that I read in 2019 that I really enjoyed and I highly recommend. I have 3 works of fiction that I want to include in my honorary mentions, and first up is Tough Voyaging by George R.R. Martin, and I highly recommend this if you like your sci-fi novels with a dose of ecological awareness. Whether or not you like Martin's more famous books, this is a really interesting sci-fi with a very unusual protagonist. The Age of Innocence by Edith Wharton nearly made my top 5, but not quite. It's still an excellent book. This is probably the only classic work of literature that I read in 2019, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. It's a poetic and melancholy work that I'll be rereading just as soon as I get a chance to do so. Finally, for my honorary mentions, I have to include a book that I've just finished within the last few days, and that is Rufus Marigold by Ross Murray. Ross is a New Zealand-based illustrator who suffers from crippling social anxiety, and he channels the everyday horrors of this into the primate at the centre of Rufus Marigold. As someone with a lifelong affliction of social anxiety myself, I related to many of the feelings expressed in this work, and it was just refreshing to read something that treats the condition with the right balance of humour and seriousness, although it does go to some very dark places indeed. Alright, so that's the honorary mentions out of the way, so let's get into the top 5. And at number 5 is Why We Get the Wrong Politicians by Isabel Hardman. I could have included several of the books that I've already mentioned at number 5 in this list, but I think that Hardman's book is important, to understand the particular moment that British politics has now reached. I listened to this on Audible. It's read by Isabel Hardman, and I think she brilliantly conveys the strange mix of pathos and absurdity that is life in Westminster. And it charts an MP's existence, if you will, from the process of being selected as a candidate standing for office right through to being elected out of office and everything in between. Her conclusion really is that the process for selecting candidates is deeply flawed, that Westminster is a toxic culture to work in, and MPs are wholly unprepared for life outside of Westminster when they are quite often booted out unexpectedly on election night. After 3.5 years of unceasing turmoil in British political life that now seems to be taking a new turn with the recent Conservative landslide, you really owe it to yourself to read this book to gain an insider's view of the people who make the laws in the United Kingdom and the really broken culture that they work in. At number 4 is Lovecraft Country by Matt Ruff. Now, I recently looked at how the horror genre can be used to explore race relations in the United States, and I contrasted how that's achieved in Lovecraft Country with how it is not really achieved in Thinner. Lovecraft Country does it really well, which is probably unsurprising given this is one of my favourite books of 2019. And I'm really looking forward to the forthcoming HBO adaptation of this book. It really brilliantly balances the everyday horrors of racism in 1950s America with the supernatural horrors of the plot, which go beyond the Lovecraftian tropes that you'd expect based on the title. Do yourself a favour and read this book. Even if you're not really into horror, it's just a brilliant, very clever piece of work. Number 3 is Killers of the Flower Moon, The Osage Murders and the Birth of the FBI by David Grann. This is another non-fiction work that I listened to on Audible. It's read brilliantly by Anne-Marie Lee in the early sections, which focus on Molly Burkhart and the several mysterious deaths within her immediate family. And then it's read by Will Patton in the middle section, which switches the narrative focus to the former Texas Ranger turned FBI agent Tom White as he investigates these strange deaths. And then finally by Danny Campbell, who stands in for the author as he visits Osage County and learns from the present day inhabitants and the terrible legacy that they've inherited. This is a book that I kept thinking about, especially after seeing the Black Wall Street massacre as portrayed in the opening sections of HBO's brilliant adaptation of Watchmen, and realising that this took place around the same time and in practically the same place that dozens of Native Americans were being murdered for their oil-rich land in Osage County. If there are two events that encapsulate the white supremacist foundation on which much of the US's power is built, those two events would be the Black Wall Street massacre and the Osage murders. And if you'd like to learn more about the latter, then I highly recommend David Grann's book. At number 2 is the Stephen King book that I've been promising all along, and that is Firestarter. And it really wasn't that difficult choosing my favourite Stephen King book of the 20 or so that I've read so far, as I've progressed through them in chronological order. Firestarter has gripping action sequences, squeamish horror, and a really unsettling relationship between an emotionally manipulative antagonist and a vulnerable girl with apocalyptic powers. In a way, Firestarter takes the question at the centre of Carrie, i.e. what happens if an emotionally troubled girl possessed with extraordinary supernatural powers is pushed beyond her breaking point. And it finds a new, and I'd argue even better answer to that question in this book. Firestarter was everything that I wanted from a Stephen King novel, and I think the format works really well. You have essentially an extended chase sequence in the first section, followed by the psychological horror of the second half, and then a literally explosive finale. I think it's an example of a horror writer working at the peak of his talents, and for me this is by far the best Stephen King book that I've read so far. And finally we arrive at number 1 in my list of the top 5 books I read in 2019, and because these are my rules, I am going to cheat and I'm going to choose 2 books for first place. That's right, it's like the Booker Prize all over again, and I'm going to jointly award first place to The Luminaries by Eleanor Catton and We Are Here, an Atlas of Aotearoa by Dr. Chris McDowell and illustrated by Tim Denee. 2019 was the year that I moved to New Zealand, and these are both books about New Zealand. The Luminaries is a fictionalised account of New Zealand's past, in which a series of intertwined mysteries play out over the course of around 800 pages, written in a pastiche of Victorian literature. Now, it seems you can't really talk about The Luminaries without mentioning that it is Eleanor Catton's debut novel. It was published when she was 28 years old, and it won the Booker Prize, which is an astonishing achievement, but it fully earns all the accolades. I really couldn't put this book down. It's brilliant. I really recommend it. We Are Here, on the other hand, takes a data-led look at New Zealand, and it's filled with beautiful maps and stunning visualizations that look at this country via 7 distinct angles. Water and air, living things, places, people, government, movement and energy, heart and memory. And Dr. McDowell gave a lecture about the making of this book a little while ago, and I was fortunate enough to attend, and it really made me appreciate just how much work went into this book. After several false starts, it took him 5 years to pull this thing together in the end. It's a real labour of love, and the end product is an essential contribution to the ongoing narrative about this country and its people. It's also just a gorgeous work of art in its own right, and I'm really proud to own a copy. So that's it. I've mentioned a whole bunch of books today, and the top 5, or technically 6, I think are nicely balanced between fiction and non-fiction. Have you read any of these books? If so, then please do let me know in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel. And in the meantime, I'd just like to wish you a happy new year. And I will see you in 2020 for more bookish things. See you soon.